One of the most persistent features of moral injury is not fear, anxiety, or even anger, but self-condemnation. Individuals suffering moral injury frequently direct moral judgment inward with extraordinary severity. They do not merely regret what happened, they judge themselves to be morally tainted by it. This raises a deeply unsettling question. Is self-forgiveness possible? And if so, is it morally justified? This is not a therapeutic question alone. It is a philosophical and ethical question about responsibility, moral agency, guilt, and the limits of moral judgment. Moral injury and harsh self-judgment. Moral injury is characterized by a distinctive pattern of moral appraisal. The individual accepts responsibility, often excessive responsibility. The moral failure is interpreted as identity-defining. The self is judged as unworthy of forgiveness. This harsh moral posture differs from ordinary guilt. Guilt can motivate repair and reconciliation. Moral injury often freezes moral agency by collapsing the distinction between having done wrong and being irredeemably wrong. Self-condemnation becomes totalizing. The ethical tension around self-forgiveness. Self-forgiveness is ethically controversial. On one side lies the concern that forgiving oneself minimizes wrongdoing, evades accountability, risks moral complacency. On the other side lies the reality that permanent self-condemnation destroys moral agency, endless guilt prevents restitution, responsibility, and growth. Moral life cannot continue without some form of self-reconciliation. The ethical challenge is to determine whether self-forgiveness can be morally serious rather than morally evasive, distinguishing forgiveness from excuse. A crucial clarification must be made. Self-forgiveness is not denial of harm, justification of wrongdoing, erasure of responsibility. Rather, it involves full acknowledgment of moral failure, acceptance of responsibility within realistic limits of agency, refusal to define the self solely by the worst action. Ethically legitimate self-forgiveness presupposes moral seriousness. It is only meaningful where genuine guilt exists, agency, control, and moral limits. Many cases of moral injury involve distorted responsibility attribution. Individuals judge themselves as if they possessed complete control over outcomes, perfect moral knowledge under extreme conditions, unlimited freedom in coercive environments. Ethical analysis requires redrawing the boundaries of agency. Questions must be asked. What options were genuinely available? What constraints, institutional, situational, coercive, were present? What degree of moral control did the agent realistically possess? Self-forgiveness becomes possible only when responsibility is truthfully, not harshly, assessed. Moral identity and the possibility of repair. Moral injury threatens a person's moral identity. The individual no longer experiences themselves as a participant in the moral community. Self-forgiveness plays a restorative role by re-establishing moral agency, allowing moral learning rather than moral paralysis, making responsibility productive rather than destructive. Without some form of self-forgiveness, moral identity collapses into despair or nihilism. Paradoxically, refusing self-forgiveness can itself become morally problematic because it prevents ethical repair, reconciliation, and responsibility toward others. The role of others in self-forgiveness. Self-forgiveness rarely begins internally. It often emerges through recognition by morally trusted others, compassion offered before it is believed deserved, shared moral reasoning that contextualizes responsibility. Therapeutically and ethically, self-forgiveness is frequently learned, not declared. The presence of another who can say in effect, "You are more than this act," is often decisive. Religious and secular perspectives. Some religious traditions reject the idea of self-forgiveness, insisting that forgiveness must come from God or from those harmed. Yet even within these traditions, moral repair requires that individuals learn to live as forgiven, not merely declared forgiven. From a secular ethical perspective, self-forgiveness is justified when it preserves moral accountability, supports ethical transformation, enables continued moral participation. Across traditions, the core concern is the same: how to hold guilt without annihilating the self. Self-forgiveness as moral courage. Self-forgiveness is not moral weakness. It is morally demanding. It requires facing wrongdoing without evasion, accepting limits of control without self-deception, carrying moral memory without perpetual self-punishment. In this sense, self-forgiveness is not the abandonment of morality, but a commitment to moral life after failure. Concluding perspective. Moral injury confronts individuals with the darkest question moral life can pose. Can I still be a moral person after what I have done or witnessed? Ethically defensible self-forgiveness answers neither with denial nor with despair. It affirms responsibility while refusing moral annihilation. If moral injury reveals the depth of human moral seriousness, self-forgiveness reveals the conditions under which moral life can continue after catastrophe. The goal is not innocence regained, but moral agency restored.